Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Hugh. I am so excited to be here interviewing a very special guest who, like me, is here literally all the time. My wife, Priya Parker, brilliant author, conflict resolution facilitator, and gatherer. So you have dedicated your working life to the question of how people come together and how they come apart. Because I'm your husband as well as a close reader of your work, I know why you do that work. But can you talk about how your family background and early life prepared you to be the Queen of Gathering?
Well, first, thank you for saying yes to interviewing me today.
I know you considered a lot of other people, our children.
Exactly, yeah. My quarantine buddy. I think like so many people, my work is deeply influenced by the way that I was raised and my experience as a young person. And as you know, I'm biracial, I'm bicultural. I have a mother who is Indian from the north and a white American father and from Iowa. And they were kind of, for the first 12 years of their marriage, they were kind of each other's source of adventure, rebellion. I was born in Zimbabwe. Every 2 years, they would pick up and move to another country. We lived in the Maldives and Indonesia and India and eventually moved back to the States. And within a year, they separated. And within 2 years, they divorced. And within 3 years, they each remarried other people, as you know. And they had
doubled down.
And doubled down. In a way, they each went back to kind of the worlds that they originally came from. And I'm their only child, and they had joint custody. So every 2 weeks, I would go back and forth between these two homes. And it was and still is leaving my mother and stepfather's home, a Indian, British, Buddhist, vegetarian, atheist, agnostic on hopeful days, liberal, vegetarian, landmark forum-y family. And I would travel 1.4 miles to my father and stepmother's home. And it was and still is a white American, evangelical Christian, conservative, Republican, twice a week church-going, climate skeptic family. And I was a part of both. My name, as you know, is Priya Parker. And a huge part of the way I was raised was literally every 2 weeks going back and forth between two created realities that often denied each other's truths.
A lot of people don't know your middle name is 1.4 miles, actually.
Exactly. Priya 1.4 miles Parker.
Yeah.
And so I've always been interested in why we come together and why we come apart. And in a sense, because every 2 weeks I had two almost very, very different ways to start dinner, ways to have people over, ways to celebrate, ways to mark, ways to mourn. I knew that there wasn't just one way to be. And I became a group conflict resolution facilitator.
And so I want to get into all that, but I want to actually flash forward to a year ago. Things are a little more than a year ago. Things are, they are what they are in the world. I'm not saying they're good or bad, but they're not this. Mm-hmm. You're dedicated your life to this question of gathering. And then suddenly a pandemic hits. Do you remember the moment when you realized, oh gosh, this thing that is my thing in the world is about to die?
I started noticing that the word gathering, which is a word out there, but not often in a lot of headlines, was taking a lot of ink. I started seeing gatherings canceled, governor of Washington limiting size of gatherings, like all of this discourse that often public policy officials, the CDC arguing about the size of gatherings, which is usually the domain of like nerdy facilitators and sociologists arguing about group size, all of a sudden like arguing about public health and becoming not just dangerous, but illegal. And I think the moment that I started to realize that this was going to be huge and affect all of us was actually watching the fight, the argument, the tension about South by Southwest canceling or not. Like, I remember reading those headlines. I remember watching like the standoff between the city of Austin and the organizers of South by Southwest, basically debating, like, at some level, as a facilitator, who has the authority to cancel something with such high stakes? If it's like, people calculating the local Austin budget and how it was the economy bump of $350 million from South by Southwest, and do you cancel this thing? And when they finally called it, that was the moment. And then also the NBA being canceled. That was when I started to realize that the ways in which we have been coming together for a very long time were going to be massively, massively interrupted.
I remember that also last year, but I will say for people who know a little bit of Texas history, there's something nice about the fact that it was at least a non-violent standoff, which was a interesting twist for Texas. So what did you do when you realized that people were about to go through a very long spell of ungathering? Was your first reaction, guess I'm going to take the next year off, I guess I have nothing to offer these people? Or did you think there was a way to help people ungather the way you dedicated yourself to helping them gather?
I, as a facilitator, the way I think about my work is I am somebody who understands how to help, or who tries to help a group, despite significant obstacles, connect. And my training is often those obstacles could be race or power or gender or different visions in a company. And I realize at some level that not being able to come together physically in person is a significant obstacle to meaningful connection. And so the first thing I did was, fortunately, I'm not tied to the form of a gathering. Like the book that I wrote is called The Art of Gathering, and that was a bit awkward. And I also understood
advocating an illegal activity.
Exactly. And I think the other thing is, at the time I was working on a podcast with the New York Times that was supposed to be called, I think I can share this, that was supposed to be called Gathering with Priya Parker. We had for 9 months, our teams had brides with voice memo apps turned on, walking into the audio of their weddings, about to practice a different way of getting married. We had audio teams going through schools, reimagining their galas to have them more equitable, and but hadn't launched yet. And a producer texted me that week, and he said, a show called Gathering is now going to sound like a horror film. We have to pause. We have to stop. The meaning of this word is completely different over the course of 5 days. We have to stop. And I remember talking to you. We went on a walk, and
spent a lot of time together.
We spent a lot of time together. And I noticed that in my inbox and my DMs and my Instagram, is that called DMs also? I was getting I was still getting a lot of questions. The questions were turning though. And the questions were things like, we've planned our wedding for the last 3 years. It's supposed to be in 2 months. Do we cancel it? Do we do it on Zoom? Do we postpone it? Teachers asking, how do I teach virtually? How do I connect with my students when I can't physically touch them? And so we paused, and I realized we still need to figure out how to meaningfully navigate together, and we will be coming together, just not physically. How do we actually do this? And so we pivoted, and we launched a podcast live in a distributed team called Together Apart. Every episode answering one person's question about how to navigate this moment in a way with a group that you care about when you can't all be in the same room.
So here's one thing I wanted to do for the good people listening to this. I think it's been such a year, like a head down year of just trying to figure out what's the next thing in front of you, just trying to get through the day, just trying to get through the week, just trying to do your job, feed your children, whatever it is. And this year's eventually going to take a lot of processing, cultural processing. What is it that we really lived through? What is it that we did? How did we change? How do we think about it? So I wonder if we can just go through almost like a lightning round of some of the cultural phenomenon, shared cultural phenomenon of this year. And if you can kind of help give us a first draft of gathering history,
okay,
as we go. So I want to start with the 7 p.m. pot clanking in New York City for first responders, and of course there were versions of this around the world. What do you make of the meaning of that kind of phenomenon and things like it in this past year?
The 7 p.m. clanking was interestingly, it was actually started by a PR firm. It was, and Amanda Hess and I just sort of discussed this sort of 4 weeks later, 5 weeks later, when it actually took hold. I mean, you have videos, you can still see them in the West Village, in the Upper West Side, in Brooklyn, all like massively at 7 p.m. People would walk out in Brooklyn. People would play like cellos and bass on their porches, on their stoops. It became a viral sensation, and well beyond the PR firm, and in part because it hit a collective need. And what that moment was every evening was a collective mechanism to help people name, face, process, acknowledge this chaotic, scary moment. And as I watched it, I was very moved by it, in part because I think, particularly in the US, we are so like resistant to an idea of like anything collective at the same time, synchronistically. That
we always think we're like a couple drinks away from communism.
Yeah, exactly. That it was one of, as a facilitator, it was one of the healthiest expressions of a daily ritual. I spoke with people as they kind of processed it day to day, and they said it's a way to end the workday when there's actually no commute home. It's a way to actually exit when there are no more doorways or passages or cars to get in or cars to get out. It's a way to come out and see, even though I'm in my head or on my computer, oh my goodness, I have neighbors all around me. And many people who didn't know their neighbors ahead of time, to actually visibly, physically have a moment in time to be together, but with a purpose. And if you remember, it wasn't just clanking, it was clanking to thank first responders. And so there was a social contract every evening, again and again, to say thank you, that was grounded in gratitude. And so even sociologically, a ritual that's grounded in gratitude, all of this research shows, basically helps us build resilience, helps us build collective will. And for the first responders coming home, helps them know that they are being seen.
Zoom. So many of us spent so much time on Zoom this past year. No one feels necessarily good about having done that, but it happened. I wonder how you process the kind of cultural meaning of Zoom as it evolved from this kind of fringy thing to something everybody was doing, and the cultural practices of gathering that you saw developing on it.
So Zoom, and I'll use Zoom kind of as a verb, as a technology, but fill in the synonym of whether it's Microsoft Teams or Skype. But Zoom kind of is.
We don't want to discriminate against Microsoft Teams, but who really uses Microsoft Teams? What is Microsoft Teams?
I remember a tweet from
How did that company blow that advantage?
DeRay tweeted a couple of weeks ago something just like, Microsoft Teams is not it. And it was like the most commented on tweet. I think many of these technologies are rapidly trying to figure out what they're for. And Zoom, like so many technologies, was not created for all of the use cases that was demanded of it over the last 12 months, right? It was really a workplace, kind of a place for formal meetings. And people have used it for choir practice, right? Which they discovered quite early that the way that the algorithm was built was not imagining that people would want to hear each other at the same time. And so the mic chooses which word, and it always sounds like which screen to prioritize, and it always sounds like a solo, right? Like, we've used it for funerals. We've used it for weddings. Like, you and I have attended multiple weddings on Zoom. We use it for, meetings, for parent-teacher conferences, for interviews. And I think, so a couple of things. I think overall, Zoom is not a place, right? Like, and that sounds kind of funny, but it's like, Zoom is not a place. It's a contextless place. There's a little bit of context, the squares, the exit the room, enter the room, but it's a place from a facilitator's eye in which you, as the people, have to create the context. You don't have a door to come into. You don't have almonds on the table. You don't have music playing. You don't have a decision to choose which chairs to sit in and whether you're a front of the room person or a back of the room person. And so I think a couple of things. One is, as I think about the year in review, it's really hard to hide a bad meeting on Zoom. because there's no distractions, right? Like you can't subsidize a bad meeting by like the great chocolate covered almonds in the middle of the table, or by like grabbing the person you actually want to talk to on the way out of the room.
I like to do the 25-minute bathroom break in a bad meeting.
Exactly.
Can't do that in Zoom either.
Exactly. I mean, you can sort of like mute and like turn your camera off and chat like I'm still here.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to hide a bad meeting. And so I think one of the things that happened quickly for a lot of companies and organizations is like it revealed bad meetings, right?
And maybe bad companies and organizations.
Absolutely.
Bad cultures.
Absolutely. Power dynamics were actually it's made much more explicit. I remember reading an article early on about how mansplaining was actually even more pronounced on Zoom because the way the algorithm work, it prioritizes like any or right. It's like if you don't like just get in there, Zoom is not going to help you get in there. But what is it good for? I think it's overall it's like decent for like formal, structured conversations. It kind of mimics Robert's Rules of Order. There's elements where I've heard from diplomats and facilitators where actually in certain contexts of a lot of hierarchy, squares can be equalizing, right? Like it depends on the context. And the breakout rooms, can be created, but you need to be able to do it well. And learn like how do you create a doorway? How do you enter this place? How do you exit? What it's really bad for is spontaneity, informality, right? And actually, in my field, conflict. It's really hard to have like productive, healthy, tense conversations because it's easier to exit, right? You don't have the different mechanisms of like everyone's in here together. And so I think that as an entire technology, it blew up at a moment where it had enough bandwidth and infrastructure for us to use it. And now there's a lot of companies trying to solve a lot of its problems.
One good use case I will mention that we're in together is that we started taking an improv class. And that was something that you'd think would be bad on Zoom, but it actually turns out to be great on Zoom. And it's a class with friends of ours from across the country who we'd never otherwise take a class with. And actually, because people can turn off their video, you can do skits, big skits, small groups. So there's some actually surprising things that are good on Zoom.
And also one more thing, like we've been to weddings on Zoom, and there's some it's like the same technology, and there's some weddings, and some of this is from my research. I'm not like calling out my friends, but there's some weddings where the chat is totally silent, right? Like pin drop silence, and you're watching two people get married. And there's other weddings where the chat is like a peanut gallery and a baseball game and like church all in one. And people are laughing and chatting at each other, huge groups, 250 people, 300 people. And a huge part of that is how the host set up the context and the norms in the first few minutes, that a beloved cousin like type something in. And so you can have the same category done really well or done in a way that feels like you're watching a show.
Another defining thing of this year that in some ways was separate and apart from the pandemic and another way intersected with it was the Black Lives Matter protests last summer and onward. Do you think they were a historical event? I mean, obviously they happened because of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and other cases, but do you think they unfolded the way they did or had the galvanizing power they did because of the plague year we were in?
Yes. And speaking with activists who are part of those movements, they would agree. I think it's a combination of both just, 6 months, however long it was, 8 months of people in quarantine, and actually not the danger of coming into physical public space wasn't worth it at some level. And I think that specifically the confluence around and the attention around everybody's at home, like watching their screens. The murder of George Floyd was a individual and a collective calculation that this is worth putting myself in harm's way for, right? It's almost like this is worth going out onto the streets for. And there was a collective focus moment and many years building up to it. If Ferguson, this was already a very successful movement. But as a friend of mine, said to me, if I don't go out on the streets for this, then what? Like, what is my body for?
On a very different note, sea shanties. That was another, and I would say these kind of collaborative TikTok things. There have been various versions of it. But what do you make of the sea shanties phenomenon and our urge to do these like collective artistic things this year?
So I loved the sea shanties. As you know, I would like play the sea shanties on YouTube on repeat in our car for our children, and like, you know, me and our children would like sing and sing the song, hum the song again and again and again. And I think one of the reasons why that's like, I think his name is Nathan Evans, why that specific Wellerman song took off, is one is like, it's like a very simple note and a very simple beat that anyone can learn. It's in the form of a collective song. Like, what is a shanty? What is a sea shanty? It was a song that people sang, or a form of, you know, different beats when they were working, when they were passing the time, when they were in passage. And when I saw this sea shanty, particularly of the remixing of first Nathan Evans, and then like eventually people all over the world, and then like a cat, and then like an electronic DJ, like introducing the different beat to the song, it was this collective moment of, to me, of saying like, we're passaging together, right? Like it's a song, if you listen, it's like haunting music. It's a very old tune. And it's this promise of like, one day when the weathermen come, you know, they'll bring us sugar and tea and rum. It's like this, it felt to me like this collective moment of like singing and marking time together in a way that still, like TikTok allowed people to express their like wide interpretations of this one simple collective expression of being together in a passage and waiting for this like future promise.
So in your work, you are very clear that gathering is a morally neutral tool, like the internet or a spoon. It can be used by bad people, by good people, for bad, for good. And often the bad guys are better at it. Often the bad guys actually, I mean, you think about the worst movements in history, often involved real gathering intelligence. So I think about January 6th, another tentpole event of the year gone by, that insurrection. And you've said, I think, that Trump understood gathering in a way that many good people in American public life did not. Can you talk about Trump as gatherer, and maybe what people who are on the other side of that kind of politics need to learn about gathering?
So first, you know, I'll just say gathering is a tool, right? And I define a gathering as any time 3 or more people come together with a purpose, with a beginning, middle, and end. It's an event. And well before January 6th, so I'll just detangle January 6th and Donald Trump. Like back in 2016, I remember saying to you, Trump understands gathering, right? His rallies were like tent revivals. And I'm not the first one to say this. Like you go, and it's just like, I remember watching The Circus, the documentary of following around these candidates, and then watching exit interviews leaving Trump rallies, and people saying like, I don't know, just something happened, right? There's this expression of emotion, of identity, the hats, like physical symbols, the rituals of actually like wearing a tribal, you know, artifact, of standing in line, of having an outgroup, right? Like the press behind, and actually having like a focus of a threat. They are not us, we are not them. And I think, and as we were, you know, as we were preparing for this past election, looking at the different candidates and looking at, you know, how beyond, like, you don't create, a gathering is not an intellectual sport, right? It's a way of coming together that ideally, by the form of gathering, you change people. People leave change. They leave feeling hope. They leave
intellectually, but physiologically, emotionally.
Those are my people. This is the world I want to experience. That's what America should be, right? That, and what I'm pointing to could literally be, you know, MAGA hats, or it could be a diverse group of people committed fiercely to pluralism, doing something else. But part of what I'm looking for is like, what's that something else? And I think Trump, as a gatherer in chief, understood how to host, how to create, how to respond. I mean, it's almost like watching a really good comedian interact with an audience. There's a flow between host and guest, as there should be, but it can be used for all ends.
But why do you think it is that people, I mean, someone like Trump, who is so misanthropic, hates humanity, wants to, frankly, is going to make the lives of everybody, even in his own rallies, worse? Why is someone like that even able to do that? Whereas people who quite clearly want to bring people together, whose politics is a politics of bringing people together, but often don't create a goosebumpsy rally, it's like wonky, and it's like the policy, totally. But there's no feelings strategy.
So I think it's because meaning lies in specificity, and rituals that are really powerful tend to historically come from groups that believe the same thing, that dress in the same way, that pray to the same God, that eat the same food, so that when the red thread is tied around your left wrist, in southern India, everyone bursts into tears and they understand what the red thread means. And I think part of the challenge on the left and in any modern diverse society is that we're afraid of offending each other. And so you don't have, you're like we need to actually reinvent modern rituals around values, not around, race or specific religion. And it's a huge opportunity to do, but you have to be okay with deeply thinking about who are we and how do we actually create rituals around who we want to be. We don't actually have rituals. They need to be invented and created. And so I think that's a big loss.
So what's the modern version? Let's say you're crafting the Joe Biden rally or the Kamala Harris or Pete Buttigieg or Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders rally of the future or past. What could they do that is not chest thumping, tribal nationalism, chauvinism, but that would make people feel those kind of feelings that generally they don't do right now?
I mean, first, I think the DNC this year was a good example of some of this in practice. I was very impressed by the virtual DNC. It was set up to be I would think totally awkward, stale, conservative, safe. And I mean,
that's just the policy.
Exactly. And if you think about the roll call, right? The roll call, which was an event that existed in all other DNCs where people, I mean, I don't even know what used to happen at a roll call. It was like this non-event for anyone outside. You just basically say what state you are and what being present. And if you remember, what they actually did was that they, each state got a moment. Remember the calamari, Rhode Island,
yes.
Alaska, Wyoming, and each person, there was a person. I will remember for the rest of my life. I think Montana was it's really hard to participate in things when your Wi-Fi is bad, right? They reinvented a ritual that everybody, where they were in the state, you could see how complicated this country is. Each person got a moment to say who they were in it visually, but yet it was a beautiful image of how improbable it is that we are a country.
I wonder what you get escaping from the lightning round now. Which wasn't really.
Good. I'm going to take a glass of water.
Wasn't really a lightning round.
Is that a little shade?
No, not at all. Not at all. What you observed as some of the most interesting experiments that people engaged in this year when they couldn't gather or when they had to gather differently? What are the newest, strangest things, particularly things that may actually outlive this plague year?
I mean, if I just think back a year ago, I think one of the first ones where people were like, whoa, what is happening was, it was actually a year ago this weekend, was D Nice's DJ set.
I got a notification today. That guy's still at it.
He's now doing a 24-hour anniversary DJ set, Taylor Mac style, right now, starting this weekend. So that moment was, at some point, 100,000 people had entered the Instagram room, and it was 100,000 people. So it was humongous. But Janet Jackson was in the room. Michelle Obama made an appearance. Bernie Sanders apparently made an experience. Mark Zuckerberg made an experience, and someone joked he should buy everyone a round of beers, right? And D Nice was reacting in real time. You could see his head kind of exploding. Janet Jackson came in and he's freaking out, and he stops and he plays Janet Jackson songs for 4 minutes to honor his guest. And so that experiment to me was fascinating because it was a simultaneous example of both no velvet rope right? Anyone could access this democratic space while still having actually a sense of like a velvet rope, in the sense that like it was this weird, beautiful democratic experience of exclusion and inclusion simultaneously existing. And when I mean exclusion, it's like it was exclusive enough that or safe enough is maybe a better word, that our heads of state were willing to like enter for a second, and yet literally anyone with an internet connection could join. So I thought that was a fascinating experience. A second one that I will always remember is a tweet that I read by, I think his handle is Jimmy Riss. And the tweet was something like, last night I experienced something that felt uniquely digitally native. I was in a party and I was in a Zoom room and I ended up in the hot tub room, and everybody was sitting in their own tubs, like at home. And it turned into a game of naughty truth or dare. And I remember seeing this tweet and it like blew my mind, in part because, and in part because it was,
I think that wasn't that the Zoom Jeffrey Toobin was supposed to be on.
Exactly.
I think he like pressed
he entered the wrong Zoom link.
Yeah, because sometimes in the calendar you can just
it happens all the time.
Yeah.
And so like one, it was like an experiment of a global party, but it was this idea offer that we have been thinking we need to block out all of the life behind us. What about, when appropriate, centering it? And so like if you're a Lamaze teacher and you're all, and you have couples or individuals all over the country, like learning to give birth, they're now actually in their own homes, right? There's where you can actually see where they might practice breathing, right? If you're a chef or a teacher of, cooking, you can actually see people's pantries if you think about it. So I think experiments like that are interesting. Another one that I've been really moved by is a group, I think they're now called Girls Trek. I learned about them in June, right during the racial uprising. A member of them told me about it. And at the time it was 60,000 Black women and girls all across the country, for their mental health, simultaneously listening to a podcast about Black female history, Black women history, while walking. And I just thought, like, what a beautiful, gorgeous collective experience in like empowering self-care, in navigating like the dangers of being outside and moving, but also that you can synchronistically listen to a podcast at the same time.
That's a good segue to the next question. I want to ask you about this kind of racial reckoning that the country is living through right now, beyond the protests of last summer, raised in many ways by the questions of those protests, but really gone beyond into every organization, newsrooms, companies, universities. You actually do, your public-facing work is more about gathering, but you do a lot of conflict work in your practice, and a lot of this racial reckoning work, one way or another. Can you talk about what you think is happening? There's clearly people who feel like we're actually getting somewhere. We're on the verge of this, exciting moment. There's other people who feel like this is cancel culture run amok, and usually those people are just like scared because they are on the wrong side of a lot of things. But I just wonder how you think about this racial reckoning moment.
I work within some of these organizations, but I also just like watch in the news what's happening with organizations around the country. And there's a pattern that I've seen, that in those first 2 weeks after George Floyd's murder, there were a number. Basically, it was what I would call a triggering event. It was an event that was unignorable, both as a country, but also within organizations, families, systems, groups. And there was this dynamic, and I think probably the most famous example of this is the Wing, the Women's Social Club, of an organization wanting to put out a statement in support of Black lives, and employees, staff internally saying, basically, like, don't do that until you get your house cleaned inside, right? And and you read this, like this has happened in the New York Times. The Tom Cotton op-ed was sort of a similar moment, if you remember that. There's this decision to publish, and then black staff and other staff on Twitter, I think it was this op-ed endangers my colleagues or something like that. It was there were multiple moments that are forcing internal reckonings, and I think it's a good thing. Like, I think overall, as a facilitator, we are in a moment of national, group, family, system grappling. And grappling, when done well, asks the fundamental questions of like, who are we? Who did we think we are? Who has it been revealed that we actually are? And how do we go about fixing that? And the fixing is extraordinarily messy, in part because, and this gets more to your work, like we are the first multicultural, multiracial democracy in history. And we're inventing the answers. And so I think it's extraordinarily messy, but I think that there are these moments that it's not like what happened with BLM is not just the protest and not just the memory of the protest, but it fundamentally shifted the conversation that has forced facings in every level of every group, like in the country.
One of the saddest and strangest aspects to the past year is that so many people died, but died alone, suffered alone, died alone. In some cases were buried alone because of the difficulty of doing funerals. And it sometimes feels like, because of how unwitnessed those hundreds of thousands of deaths were comparatively, obviously families have had their deaths in their families unwitnessed, but collectively there's been a witnessing deficit from this just gigantic loss of life. What have you observed about the practice of grief in this time? And what collective grieving do you think we're going to still have to do once we're able to actually do everything?
We are experiencing both collective and individual levels of grief at a level that we've never at least been aware of before. And I mean, to the point where I was sort of joking earlier that the field of, arguing about group size used to be just facilitators, and then it became part of the public debate. Like, grief experts, which I am not, are now having op-eds about the different types of grief, educating the public. There's anticipatory grief, right? Which was like in March and April, of like all the things we will not be able to do, all the people we may lose. Now there's like anniversary grief, right? All of the elements that are coming up as you get notifications of where you were 1 year ago, and you seeing the collapse of like the pictures over 2 weeks. And I think, so first of all, there is expertise and wisdom in fields that exist to help us with this moment. There's groups like the Dinner Party that was started almost a decade ago that just produced a PDF to help create collective grief, mechanisms. But what I would say just overall is, like, facilitation, gathering, ritual, the act is making the implicit explicit. So what do I mean by that? There was this beautiful article, I think it was by Reuters recently, of a phone booth in Japan. It's like 300 kilometers north of Tokyo, and it's called the wind phone, or the phone booth of the wind, something like that.
It sounds better in the original Japanese.
And a neighbor put it up to actually originally to help survivors of the 2011 tsunami. And it's a phone booth in a field with a black phone, like an old school rotary phone, and it's an unconnected line. And it's a way for people grieving the loss, the survivors grieving the loss of their loved ones, to go pick up the phone and have a conversation with those they've lost. And it's a beautiful piece. And they are now looking at that phone booth and I've read that people are wanting to bring it to London and to New York and to other cities to deal with COVID. And part of the act of what that process is you can go into a physical space, this ritualized space. You pick up the phone and people speak to those they've lost. And I think there are experiments happening all over the country right now to understand how do we bring from the inside outside to be able to face it, to be able to grieve it. In the Art of Gathering, I interviewed a funeral director named Amy Cunningham. This is well before COVID, and she said, it's a one of the dangers is there's a trend in America that people don't want funerals, or they want funerals to be a celebration of life. And it's a dangerous trend. And I asked her, why is it a dangerous trend? And she said, because if we do not grieve, we cannot be transformed by our grief. And so part of this moment as we reemerge slowly is to be able to be transformed by our grief so that it doesn't just sit.
We all have lived just such different lives than we have before this year. And many of the new things we practiced were terrible, were just necessities. We can't wait to get back to normal on many of those dimensions. But some of the new things, I think people will have laid tracks for themselves that they actually want to stay on to some extent. I think a lot of people who didn't fly a lot this year for the first time and who were flying 100,000 miles a year, as Lydia Polgreen recently tweeted, I think a lot of those people will not fly 100,000 miles a year anymore, even when they can. And some will double down. Some will fly 200,000 miles. I know I will cook more with the frequency that I did in the plague year than I did in prior years.
Luckily
when
for
I kind of
me.
well, I like leaned on New York's takeout options prior, and this year, like, I cooked, and I kind of want to keep that. What do you think people will keep from this year?
I think that they will. Well, I think it'll be different for each person. I think the relationship expert Esther Perel calls this entire moment like a relationship accelerator, right? And so there were a huge amount of divorces this year, but there were also marriages, right? And so I think what they it's not so much what we'll keep or not keep. I think what actually happened was a lot of collective and individual clarity of actually asking that question: what do we keep and what do we leave behind? I know for me, travel and motion is one of them. I think also as a facilitator and a lot of people who are in the kind of practitioner field, many of us our minds have been changed about what can be done virtually. Can you create connection virtually? Can therapists who want to keep doing virtual calls well after COVID? And I think that's an individual question, for each person. I watching you this year and watching you cook and benefiting from that. I think also one thing, and thank you for asking me all these questions to turn the tables a little bit. And you're a writer and you are a cultural commentator, and I've always enjoyed watching you experiment with new forms and as an artist. And so this year you launched a TV show. You
also canceled it.
I wasn't going to say that.
Yeah.
You launched and canceled it, and it was canceled.
But you can't cancel a TV show if you don't launch it.
Exactly. You went into this foray of Substack, a huge experiment with the ink, and now you are experimenting with playing with NFTs as an artist and as a writer. Like, what have you learned, and what will you keep? And tell us about what you're doing.
It's interesting you put it that way. Like, I didn't think of myself as in all three of those things in this year, but it's true. And I think, and I don't normally do like a lot of new things. I'm kind of like, I read like certain kinds of narrative nonfiction books when I was like in my 20s, realized I wanted to do that. And like, I've pretty much just done that. But I think it was the year of experiments in part because it was the year of less motion, the year of less travel. I was stuck at home and able to try things. Newsletters are really interesting.
Stuck at home, or you like really like?
Yeah, I mean, I
love being at home,
love being stuck. It's a wonderful stuckness. Newsletters, I think it's interesting. There's so much discourse around Substack, and of course, everybody pretends Glenn Greenwald's the only person who exists, which is sort of replicating the problem. But I think the reason newsletters have taken on for both the people who create them and the people who receive them is like we were all just doing less in the world. We were out there less. And so that kind of like maybe the news delivered with like a chatty flavor for a recipient, but also for the creators. Like I wasn't going and meeting people in the world.
Interesting.
And so writing an op-ed in the New York Times is a prestigious, soulless experience.
Why is it soulless?
Because it's like, it's so many people that it's no one. Right?
There's no feedback.
It's Obama's grand aunt's line to him: everybody's family, nobody's family. You know, like when you're writing something for 3 million people, like you may get letters or not get letters, but it's not an intimate, there's no connective experience. It's not like going to whereas you ask any author, you go to Books Are Magic in Brooklyn and only 25 people show up. It's still one of like the great nights of your life.
Yeah.
Right? And writing an op-ed for the New York Times will never generate that experience. So a newsletter maybe is this in-between thing. And then, I just attempted this experiment with this thing called NFTs. South by Southwest audience is probably more familiar with what they are than I am. And look, they're fascinating. They're controversial. I have followed along with all of it. I say it's an experiment because I'm not entirely sold on it. There's an environmental problem with them that needs to be fixed. There are people working to fix it. I'm working with the company that I listed on, OpenSea, to fix it. But I basically was interested in this idea of artists, and I wanted to include writers in that definition, even though they hadn't been in this technology that much, to share, to mint digital artifacts, because so much of the stuff that we produce today is digital, and it just vanishes, or it just stays in your laptop, and then one day you die and your laptop goes to a landfill. And like, writers of old had these boxes of papers, and they would donate them to the. I have no papers.
Yeah,
I have a Dropbox account, and I don't think I'm going to I don't think I'm going to donate my Dropbox account to the University of Michigan when I die.
I mean, maybe.
Even
that is being rethought.
Hit me up, UMich. You know where to find me. So I thought this NFT thing was an interesting way to take outtakes from my work, fragments, might have been directions, even a piece of cover art that I drew and we didn't use, and put them in the world in this very limited way where a bunch of people could see them, but generally one person at a time, or 5 people at a time, or 10 people at a time.
Like a private viewing.
But then it could circulate. It's already circulated several times today, all these things.
So these are decisions you make about what part of your writing or art that wasn't published that you want to put out in another form.
Yes.
That might be interesting to people.
Yes. In part, you used the word witnessed a few times in this conversation, in part because I think for a lot of different types of artistic creation, including writing, there ought to be a space in between burial and broadcasting. Right? Like when you write some words, generally it either gets buried or it gets broadcast to everyone. And particularly in a social media world where broadcast to everyone means it can't have a single sentence of error in it. I wrote passages of Winners Take All that were a little vicious, a little mean. They didn't belong in the book. They made the book less hearable. You were one of the people who were don't include that. It's good. It's trenchant, but it'll make it less hearable.
Welcome to our marriage.
Yeah, exactly. Hearable is one of Priya's favorite words. Real classic. And so I thought maybe I'd just put some of those parts out. Maybe the experiment is a terrible idea. We'll find out. I'm actually, 3:00 Eastern today, I'm going to jump in a clubhouse and talk about it with folks and talk about the good and bad of it. The NFT thing is something I'm very interested in. I'm not entirely sold on, but I'm trying it.
And I think, listening to you as you're how do we grieve, right? How do we mark these things? I think part of what an experiment is related to gathering and ritual is addressing a need you see in front of you and not having a fixed idea in your head of what it has to look like. And so much of, if you remember Thanksgiving, which feels so long ago, and there's so much controversy around the country about Thanksgiving. Do you we toggled between basically rejecting it, I'm not going to do it, we're just not going to do it at all this year, and rebellion, which is everyone's invited to my funeral for this turkey because we can have a funeral for 30 people. And so, come on Thanksgiving. And I wrote an op-ed, a lonely op-ed also for the New York Times, talking about, from our improv class, Keith Johnson's idea of an imaginative response, right? What is an imaginative response? And if for Thanksgiving in that context, to actually ask, what is happening in front of me? What is the need that I see for myself and for the people around me? And what might we invent to be able to gather in new ways, to connect in new ways, to experiment in new ways that responds to this need? Because so many of the ways that we have existed before, whether it's old-fashioned gatherings or whether it's old-fashioned platforms, no longer serve the need that's in front of us.
As you know, I used to shop at a store called Suit Supply. It supplies suits. It's Dutch. Got a couple suits there for a wedding. My size went up, so I didn't wear those suits for a while, but it's not a big deal. There was recently a Suit Supply ad. It was an obscure store, I would say. Would you agree? Until like a month ago. There was a Suit Supply ad that immediately circulated around the internet as a possible symbol of what the decade to come is going to be like. And I'll just say it involved people in suits, to be sure, but like with a very European level of buttoning. In Europe, I think they button them right before the belly button. And then just tongues.
Wow.
You didn't see this ad?
I mean, it's just interesting hearing you describe it.
Tongues everywhere, tongues galore, tongues in places. But it was a suit ad. It was an ad for suits and
I've seen the image. Is it a video or it's just a still?
It's a still.
Okay.
I've seen that image. It makes your heart still. Or beat faster, I don't know. And my question is, what are the Roaring 20s going to be like? Is the Suit Supply ad right? Are we on the verge of this kind of wild era that's coming? Are we going to be actually traumatized and not as wild as we think we are? Both? What do you think the next decade's going to be like?
I think it is going to be messy, physically messy, and at least for a while, people just deeply enjoying the physical benefits of gathering in all of the manifestations of it that we couldn't do before. And I did this podcast called Together Apart, where we'd get a call each week, and the calls that I literally didn't know what to say and how to help them were the physical ones. So the Foursquare dancing community. There's a very big, passionate Foursquare dancing community. Talking with brides and grooms about the moment of their grief of not having a physical wedding. And I'd ask them what is it that you are most what pains you the most? And it was always descriptions of thumping dance floors, of being thrown on the chair, by your people and being thrown up and down, and all of the elements that you can't replicate when through a Zoom connection. I think we are about to witness a moment for some period of time where we will no longer take for granted physical gathering, and we will see extraordinary forms of physical based joy and transgression and
tongues, belly
feet,
buttons,
everything,
European buttoning,
everything, and deep joy. And I think there will also be moments in those moments of ecstasy that we will connect with our grief, because we are safe enough to allow for that grief to come out. And and whether it's in a moment of rapture, starting to bawl, because all of a sudden, all of the things that we've been holding are allowed to be witnessed and shared and seen and okay. And so I think it'll be a mix of emotions and guilt and pleasure and a lot of basically, at least for some time, no longer taking for granted this thing that we did for very long and we're on autopilot about, which was gathering.
So get your tongues ready, get your suits out, pressed, get those buttons lowered. The decade of gathering is upon us. Thank you so much, Priya Parker.
Thank you so much, Anand Giridharadas.